Hello and welcome to this week's video homework. Today we're going to be talking about what life is made out of. What are the actual molecules that make up the bodies of both plants and animals and any other living organism. Specifically, we're going to be talking about living things and how they're made up of macromolecules, which are just very large molecules. We're going to talk about how those macromolecules are each made up of smaller units called monomer molecules, and how those monomer molecules are made up of even smaller units called atoms. We're going to ignore water for this conversation. Water is very important, but it's not really that important for this unit. So it might be helpful if you keep track of what the main molecules that make up living bodies are. There are 4 main macromolecules, and we're going to talk about 3 of them. The 3 that we're going to talk about are proteins, lipids, and carbohydrates. I will share with you what each of the monomers are called, and from there we'll take a look at what atoms make up those molecules. So feel free to pause and make this chart in your notebook so you can keep track of the names as well. First off, we're going to talk about proteins. Proteins are one of the most important molecules in animals. They make up the vast majority of the human body, and proteins sort of work like tiny little machines that are really important in doing all the functions of your body. Here's a list of a few proteins, and over here is what they might look like. Amylase is a protein like this. It's in your saliva and it helps you to digest sugar. Keratin is a protein that's in your hair and fingernails. It's really important in providing the structure that your body builds itself with. Another function of proteins can be in cell signaling and communicating stuff like your hormones, an example of which is insulin, which has this shape over here. And also we use proteins to do other important functions like carrying oxygen in our blood, which is done by hemoglobin proteins. Proteins have a very specific shape. They sort of look like a 3-dimensional wad of string, as you can see right down here. If you are able to unwind that molecule, you can see all of its smaller parts. A protein is made up of a sequence of amino acids. Each amino acid links together, as you can see over here, and that long string will wind itself up and wad itself up into a larger molecule that we call a protein. So the monomer is called an amino acid, and they make up the proteins. There are a lot of different types of amino acids, and depending on the order of the amino acids in that chain, they can make various different proteins. So what atoms are amino acids made out of? They're primarily made of carbon, which is always the C, hydrogen, the H, and oxygen, the O. Some amino acids also have nitrogen and sulfur, but they're in very, very small quantities. The majority of amino acids' mass comes from carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Going back to your table, I will repeat. Proteins are made up of amino acid monomers, and amino acids are made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen with a little bit of nitrogen and sulfur. Next up are lipids. You're probably more familiar with the words fats, oils, and waxes. Those are all lipids. Think of liposuction, where they suck out the fat from your body. That's the lipo in liposuction is lipids, like in fats, oils, and waxes. The primary function of a lipid is to store energy and also make all the cell membranes in your body. The monomers for lipids are called fatty acids. This over here is a fatty acid chain, and you can see that a fatty acid is also made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Some fatty acids also have some phosphorus in the form of phospholipids, and those make up your cell membranes, but primarily the majority of the atoms are carbon, hydrogens, and oxygens. What makes a lipid really important is the fact that you can break the bonds between each of these carbons, and every time that you do, you get a little bit of energy from the breaking of those bonds. That energy is used to power your body when you're digesting fats. So the macromolecule lipids are made up of fatty acids, and fatty acids are made up of the atoms carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and a little bit of phosphorus. Next up are carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are all the sugars, starches, and fibers that are inside of either plants or animals. Animals are made up of mostly fat and protein. Plants are made up of primarily of carbohydrates and fats. Carbohydrates are the energy storage that plants use. They also can use these carbohydrates to make up all of the cell wall that makes a plant stand strong. The reason a tree is so hard is because of this molecule called cellulose, which is a carbohydrate. The monomers for carbohydrates, something you might be familiar with, it is glucose. Glucose C6H12O6. It's a carbon ring made up of 6 carbons in this shape down here. One glucose molecule is a carbohydrate, but if you link together 2 glucose molecules, you get a different carbohydrate called sucrose. If you start linking up more and more glucose rings, you get a molecule called a starch. And if you link up a whole bunch of starches together, then you get fiber or cellulose. And sugars, like the previous molecules, are made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So to review, carbohydrates are made up of the monomer glucose, and glucose is made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. The next question you might ask is, how do we get all of these macromolecules? Where do they all come from? Organisms, both plants and animals, must take glucose, which is made in photosynthesis, and reorganize the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen into all those other molecules, the proteins, amino acids, lipids, and fatty acids. They're all just a recombination of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. You can see over here how glucose can be modified, where the bonds are changed and modified and broken apart, and you get a different molecule at the end, one we call pyruvate, but it's still the same carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen molecules. And there's only a tiny, tiny amount of the mass of all of those molecules that are nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur, which were originally taken in by plants from the soil, but that's only a tiny, tiny amount. The vast majority of the mass of organisms comes from the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen that is made in photosynthesis. There's actually one last macromolecule that we did not discuss, and that is nucleic acids. One of the most important is deoxyribonucleic acids, or DNA. And again, DNA is also made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, as well as a bit of phosphorus. But the DNA, like the others, are made from modified glucose molecules. So I hope that all made sense. Thank you for watching. And if you have any questions, I look forward to seeing you in class.